Welcome to this BI special event about green transition and also about talking about ammonia and hydrogen in particular in connection to the renewable transformation that happens in society, both in Norway and globally. And in that context, this is essential in our Executive Master Management degree in energy at Norwegian School of Business. Norwegian Business School, and we, in that context, also have tremendous international participation in it. 80% of the students are international, and we really find this is a very stimulating arena to also look at both the fossil as well as the renewable energy sources. And the discussions there are particularly interesting, and as an occasion in that connection, we are so privileged to have included this event with two Chief Executive Officers, Svein Tore Holsæter from Yara and also Christian Rynning-Tønnesen from Statkraft. That's really a great honor for us that you are here today and will discuss with us and share an hour with us. We will have this event, it goes live, and I hope as many of you will really follow this stimulating discussion. This will be an informal discussion, and we have some prepared questions, but also after 45 minutes, it opens up for Q&A from you. So you can absolutely raise questions to this event, to these distinguished CEOs. So that's really the situation today. My name is Jon Lereim. I'm then Dean for the Energy Master program at BI, and it's so interesting that we have this collaboration with industry, and the tipping point we are at the moment, you know, we have the 2050 goal for being carbon neutral, etc., and I consider that we should be front runners in the transformation towards that goal. It's ambitious. Is it realistic? We could raise a question. Absolutely. But without ambitions, we will never make it. So therefore, for us, we really should be in the forefront. As you know, Norway is net energy exporter. Statkraft is the largest hydropower producer in Europe. And that's fabulous. And you, with the international company Yara, global, with all your production all around, and your values is really human related. So I see this is a fantastic opportunity to bring this together, to think about green transformation and sustainability. And that's in line with BI's overall values: internationalization, digitalization, and sustainability. So then I have the pleasure to introduce these two guys here. We start with you, Svein Tore. Okay, go ahead. Tell about yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Jon, and thanks for the invitation to come here to talk about, I would say, the most exciting project and topic in my career. And I'm not exaggerating. I'll explain that later. But first, allow me to take a step back. We're faced with a climate crisis. There's nothing new about that. Already in 1979, scientists in the so-called Charney report described in great detail what would happen to the climate unless we changed the trajectory of emissions. 1979, yet we have done very little. And now we're in 2021, and there's 9 years left to 2030. So the time where, say, individual isolated efforts would have been enough is long past. So the only way forward now is partnership, value chain, decarbonization, and so on. And that also represents a massive business opportunity and an export opportunity here in Norway, as industries need to be electrified. Well, we have 100% renewable electricity. We have stable access to it, so there are some opportunities here. And last Friday, the Norwegian government launched the roadmap for hydrogen, and with a focus on 1 to 2 projects in Norway. So that's a very important step in creating that industry. Our production site at Herøya fits quite well with that to produce carbon-free fertilizer, carbon-free shipping fuel, and also removing 800,000 tons of CO2 emissions that are taking place today annually. So that's a true example of the Sustainable Development Goal number 17 with partnerships. But perhaps I should explain what is hydrogen and what is ammonia. And if I start with hydrogen, it's the lightest and also most abundant molecule in the universe. It's an energy carrier like electricity, so it's not a source of energy, so it needs to be produced. And that can be done 2 ways, either through natural gas, CH4, you remove the carbon and either you emit it and create gray hydrogen, or you capture the carbon and then it's blue hydrogen, or water electrolysis, where with renewable energy you do H2O and you take out the hydrogen and get green hydrogen. But it's hydrogen, as I said, it's the lightest molecule, so it's difficult to handle. So if you want to make it liquid, you need to cool it down to minus 253 degrees Celsius, so almost close to the absolute zero. So that's a challenge. And here's where ammonia is a solution, because when you add a nitrogen molecule and turn it into ammonia, you change the characteristics. Then it's minus 33 degrees Celsius. So you're able to store and transport over distances. So here's an area where Norway can play an important role. Yara is already Norway's biggest producer of hydrogen. We're a big player internationally as well on production, transport and storage. And we have pilots underway in Australia, in Netherlands, and now also with the launch of the big project together with Statkraft and Aker in Porsgrunn. So, but it's important that we move from pilots to world scale as well. We have enough pilots. We should do something that makes a huge industrial impact as well. And this will not happen by itself. If we are to meet the 2030 targets, decisions need to be made now. We're in 2021, 5 to 7 year lead time to produce. Well, then we're in 2026 to 2028. So we need to make these decisions now, and that's where governments will play an important role as well, that this is a collective effort to industrialize. We need infrastructure, we need capacity in place, but if we get it right, it could be a textbook example of creating a green industries and making that green transition.
Well, Christian, your point of view on these renewables, certainly you're essentially just producing renewable energy to a large extent, but what about when we move on to add-ons with ammonia and hydrogen? What's your perspective on that?
Thank you for inviting me here. So my name is Christian Tønnesen. I'm CEO of Statkraft. Statkraft is not only the largest producer of hydropower in Europe, we are in fact the largest producer of renewable electricity in total Europe as well, with operations in many European countries, and we are also quite large outside Europe in South America and India. And we focus on renewable energy. All new investments in Statkraft are into renewable energy, while we still have some gas-fired plants that we keep in a good shape. So how I see this whole development is that in order to cut carbon emissions, we need to address the energy area. About 3/4 of all carbon emissions or all climate emissions in the world, they come from energy in all sectors, in housing, in industry, in transport. So one can illustrate it in many forms, but it boils down to burning fossil energy. That's where the carbon is coming from, which is the dominant climate gas. So we need to address that. And renewable electricity is by far the most important part of this, to replace fossil fuels with electricity that is produced in a non-emitting way. And we expect in Statkraft that roughly from now to 2050, the electricity generation globally will double. And the share of renewable energy will grow from around 23% now to close to 75% in the same period. So it's a tripling of the share of renewable in a market that's doubling. That means it's 6 times more renewable electricity on the planet 30 years from now compared to what we have today. So this is a large step up. We also expect that close to 50% of all energy consumption in the world will come from electricity. There's a huge effective gain in efficiency as well coming from this, because electricity is much more effective than burning fuels, roughly 3 times more effective. So there's a lot of energy conservation included in this development. But since the topic today is rather hydrogen and green hydrogen, well, that all comes, green hydrogen comes from using electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. Oxygen can be used for various purposes, and the hydrogen is the fuel. So that hydrogen, the green hydrogen from electrolysis of water, is a part of what we are also looking into in Statkraft with pilots in Norway, Sweden and Germany. So I believe it is needed. We cannot have electricity in all applications around the world. We need some fuel for transport that is beyond what you can store in a battery. And if we can use hydrogen directly, that's more energy effective. So that should be used for short distance ferries, for buses, and wherever you can fill up that hydrogen. But for long distance, for air traffic and long distance shipping, and huge trucks where batteries cannot do the job, then the hydrogen comes in. And hydrogen for long distance shipping is much better stored for the reasons Svein Tore just explained, that to transport hydrogen in pure form is very complicated. You either need extreme pressure or extremely cold temperatures. If it is in the liquid form of ammonia, well, then it can be transported almost like normal fuel. We need some pressurized tanks as well, but much, much less than if it was clean hydrogen. So what we are talking about is probably something that will constitute perhaps 10% of all energy consumed in the world by mid-century can be hydrogen in pure form and partly as green ammonia as well.
Which role will you as Statkraft take into that?
Our main role here is probably going to be to produce the electricity needed. Okay. But we will also be part owners in plants like the one we are doing together with Yara and Aker in Norway. And I expect we would do some similar projects elsewhere also. So we will be a large supplier of electricity and partly also investing in the technology itself, both in hydrogen and in ammonia, which is to combine hydrogen with nitrogen from the air and make a kind of a liquid form of hydrogen there.
Do you experience there is a sense of urgency now to go towards green transformation, Svein Tore? You feel that?
Absolutely, and it has really accelerated in the last 15, 16 months. If we turn time back to March of last year, when the pandemic hit with full force globally, I had a few weeks where I thought that the work on sustainability would be put on hold to deal with the health pandemic, but I was proven wrong in that. It has actually accelerated it, and in many ways you could say sustainability in the last 15, 16 months has become mainstream, both from governments, but also when you look at business strategies, investors. If I go a few years back, how many investors, when we go on roadshows, how many investors would actually talk about ESG and be focused on that? Very, very few. Now, I can't have one meeting without that being one of the first topics being brought up. What do we do with emissions? How do we help value chains to decarbonize? And what's the future of farming and so on? So that has changed significantly. So I think the momentum is there, but it's also a result of the urgency now. We have to, if we're going to have any chance to get to the targets. And that's maybe my biggest worry as well, that when it comes to climate, there's a risk that it won't be felt hard enough by enough people until we're already past the tipping points where it's irreversible. So we need to make changes before everyone is fully impacted, but a lot of people are already impacted today. We work with farmers all over the world, and farmers are some of the people that are already hardest hit with the weather change and so on. But hopefully now we can build on the momentum that has been created in the last few months to accelerate to meet the 2030 targets.
Do you consider industry to be ahead of politicians in this respect to sense of urgency?
I would say in many cases, yes. There are many companies around the world focusing on the new technologies. But it needs to go in tandem with the politics, because here we are talking about introducing new fuel systems. And if we need an economic mechanism, we need a market here. And that needs to be regulated and decided by politicians. So how do you get compensated for not emitting CO2? It could be a price of CO2, which would be the best, because then it would function more like a normal market, but probably it needs to be combined with direct support to some of the new technologies in the beginning. Like the case was for solar panels and windmills in the beginning. Now they are the cheapest sources of electricity that you can build, because it's so huge volumes. We will see the same development in hydrogen, I would expect, and in ammonia as well. There needs to be a market regulation here to introduce this in fertilizer industry for some way of compensating green fertilizer, non-emitting fertilizers, and the same for non-emitting fuels. But this will create a market. This will be big in volumes, and then costs will go down heavily, like we have seen in solar panels, in windmills, and in batteries for that matter.
Yeah, just to build on what Christian just said on solar and your comment on governments, it's been done before. That's the positive thing. If you look at what Germany and Japan did to facilitate for the, say, long-term thinking and a predictable framework for the solar industry, that took it from being not cost competitive to now cost competitive. That would not have happened without the foresight and the long-term thinking of the governments of Germany and Japan. So we have some lighthouses here in terms of what's been done in the past, but I fully agree. We need that framework and the long-term predictability in order to make huge upfront investments.
One can compare, for instance, with high sulfur fuels. To burn sulfur is a very good source of energy. It's cheap, it's included in coal and some sorts of oil, and it produces a lot of heat, but it also creates sulfur dioxide, which is creating acid rain. And there needs to be regulations here. One cannot expect any individual customer or company to avoid this cheap source of energy named sulfur. There needs to be regulations. As I said, there's a maximum as to how much you can emit, and there's a cost to it. The same needs to be done now with carbon emissions, so CO2 emissions from burning carbon. And therefore the need of regulations is important.
In this context, how competitive do you consider ammonia and hydrogen to be in the future, in a mix of portfolio of different energy sources, renewable energy sources?
Well, I could start. If you compare hydrogen and ammonia to other renewable energy sources that are to be, say, transported from one point to the other or stored, it is very competitive. It's still, compared to the fossil fuel alternative, it's still not there yet, but that depends also on what's the cost of carbon emissions in the future.
What's your prediction on the time scale then? How far in the future, when do you think it really accelerates to take over automotive industries? You look even trucks now in Germany, Daimler-Benz, they are trying now to make hydrogen trucks, etc. So it's really coming. How is it, the time frame you expect?
It's difficult to predict, but what we see in many industries is that it starts slowly, but then it grows exponentially, and then it is important to be positioned and have solutions that are ready to ramp up at that point. But already today there is a demand for renewable energy and getting access to that, also for whether it's for transport or power generation or going into fertilizers. So there are markets already there to get started, and then there will be a need for some regulation as well to create very high demand.
What about competition?
If I just may add to the time aspect, I think in 2030, 9 years from now, this will be visible. The EU targets 6,000 megawatt by 2030 of electrolyzer installment. It's quite a substantial target. I think if we compare with the total global installations 2 years ago was 20 megawatts in 2019. I know EU alone should install 6,000 until 2030, and this is just a part of the world. But 6,000 megawatts is still small if we compare to the total energy market. So we are talking about 2040, 2050 before it's really big, where you can see it as a share of total energy consumption. But we have to make sure that Norway and other countries that want to position ourselves in this game, we need to do it now. It's too late to come after 2030 and hope that we can jump on a wagon that's already on full speed ahead.
There is a fierce competition between countries. Take, for instance, Scotland, for instance, on offshore wind. They are really aggressive. So I think that we have to see the position now. And then what about the competition in between corporations? Is it as much collaboration as you do now with Yara and with Aker Horizon? Is that models to go for?
I think so. This is a situation where we are combining deep knowledge of process chemistry. We are talking about making a chemical here. Ammonia is in nature a chemical. And doing it from electricity to splitting water to hydrogen and into a processing plant. So we need a skill set of how do you bring forward low cost, full 24/7 supply of reliable, cheap and clean electricity. And how do we convert it into hydrogen and how do we make it into ammonia? So that's probably where we will see cooperations between companies. So there will be competition between clusters of cooperation, so to speak, on the technology side. It's the same thing we have seen with batteries, for instance, and to some extent also in solar panels.
Do you think Norway can take lead position on this?
I think we can. I think Norway has a possibility to be leading in ammonia. I think there will be many countries in the world that will develop hydrogen. But what is special in Norway is that we have a huge shipping sector, and this is an excellent fuel for ships. So we can take it a step further to produce that ammonia and make it into a fuel shipping for long distance shipping. And also, since we have Yara, which is one of the leaders in the world in fertilizers, which has ammonia as the main component going into the product, we can also, via Yara, take an important position in green fertilizers. So those two areas, I think we can be leading in Norway. But that is building upon that we are already the biggest nation in Europe on producing renewable energy, much more than Scotland or any other country in Europe. And we are also having all the knowledge needed to produce the hydrogen. But we just need to take it to the very end and produce the product where we can be unique.
And you said predictability, Svein Tore. Are the politicians sufficiently aware of establishing predictable conditions for industry in this respect?
Well, it varies depending on where you are in the world, but I do think that we have a good starting point here in Norway, where there's a great awareness of the opportunities in this, and as I mentioned, I was pleased with what I saw last Friday on the ambitions on hydrogen. So that's a good step in the right direction. And then, it is important that we see this is partly about green hydrogen, partly about green ammonia, but it's also about creating new industry opportunities. As Christian mentioned, well, if you look at the shipping industry, if we're early movers there, that creates potential for say zero-emission long-distance ships as well, where you can take a leading position. So there are a lot of opportunities here, and where Norway has a particularly good starting point with our renewable energy access, and where we can play an important role in decarbonizing many industries. But again, these are very long-term decisions. For us, we make a decision now. We will have a plant up and running, say, in 5 years from now, and then we need to know that there will be a market for that product, and the predictability that business case will hold up.
Christian?
Yeah, when we talk about predictable frame conditions, it's not the same as static.
No.
Because this is an industry in a transition, in a huge development. So the predictability is partly that politicians, one election after the other, can stick to the path that we want to support hydrogen and green ammonia. To stick to the ambition and to make sure in any point in time there are things done to give support to that development. And then at a specific point in time, it's important that the frame conditions are clear and that they are calibrated so they are good enough to support the industry at the level it is, so we can make new investments, not only pilot but huge investments. Then probably just a few years later, the technology has improved. The level of support should go down accordingly, so it's again calibrated to what is needed, and that is the dynamics of this. So this is the way it's been done with offshore wind, and it's the way we should do it with hydrogen and green ammonia as well.
You mentioned maritime industry, and in that respect, is DNV, the classification society, one that is pushing forward for this transformation? I think they do quite a lot of research there, don't they?
The DNV is doing an excellent job on both looking into these technologies and also how the systems around it could be calibrated or could be designed to support developments. Yes, so it's a big cluster of companies we are talking about. It's not only those who are producing the fuel itself. It's a lot of other companies involved in everything from technology development to quality assurance and commercial operations around this.
Could we say that DNV is some kind of stabilizer or enabler for getting this as a predictable development?
What would you say, Svein Tore?
Well, they certainly have an important role to play, and they are taking that role, and it also comes with regards. One part is the audit and the regulatory part of it, but also the energy transition, where they are one of the key conveyor of the opportunities within renewable energy. So yes, they have an important role here.
Well, there are so many opportunities coming along. if we look at the different renewable energy sources more as a system, what's the impact of the grid?
The power grid?
Yeah.
Well, it's obvious we need a strong electricity grid.
Yes.
Not only in a country, but between countries. Norway is having one of the best electricity grids in the world, rated by World Economic Forum and others. So we already have a society that's electrified to a very large degree. Almost all buildings have electric heating systems, direct or heat pump based. We have a heavy industry with a lot of electricity consumption, and electricity is also extensively used in other purposes in Norway. So, and when we have a grid supporting all that, so what needs to be done is to make sure that more industry like Yara's new plant together with Statkraft and Aker, and all other hydrogen projects, and also quite a few of data centers can be hooked onto this grid. Also, there is a need to strengthen it for electrification of the offshore operations in Norway. So it needs to be developed, but that's fully possible, and an integrated part of what's happening. We also will need to have connections to the offshore wind installations that we will have in Norway, and they need to be connected also to the market. The market for offshore electricity from Norway is not Norway, it's the UK. Exactly, yes. and other countries. So indirectly there will be new cables there via the new wind farms. So we will be a corner, so to say, of a huge integrated grid in Europe in electricity. And since Norway has almost half of all the stored hydropower in total Europe, we can play a balancing role there, holding back the water when there's too much electricity in the system from a lot of wind and solar power, and buying that electricity cheap to Norway. And when there's lack of wind and sun, we will produce more than we need and export. So to play that balancing role, we can even pump backwards when the electricity is cheap enough. That will be an even more important role in the future as well.
Because that really demonstrates to have a system flexibility, in the sense that, okay, you run water down when it's needed, and then use solar and PV and wind and other sources for other purposes, really to build system thinking. And you said interconnectors.
Yeah.
Do we need to expand with even more interconnectors with continental Europe and UK?
Yeah, we will need to construct more, especially now in southern North Sea, where there is offshore wind development being out for concession to some constellations. That in itself will need at least one connection to one other European country, and this will be gradual development towards a more integrated grid. So what will happen here is, like we have seen in railroads 100 years ago, or telecommunications, or onshore grid. It starts with a point-to-point connection, then some other connections are made, and then it gradually grows into a grid. Gas pipelines in Europe is another good example there. So what is now point-to-point offshore connections will be interconnected also offshore and will turn into a grid, subsea, in between European nations. And it's much easier to get allowances to construct cables in the sea than on land. So probably we will see more sea cables coming for that reason than we will see on land. They are more expensive to build, so from that matter it should be more on land, but on the other hand it's much easier to get access, and therefore it's likely it will be a huge development there.
And just to add on that, an interesting opportunity that Ammonia represents is that we can say connect new markets with renewable energy as well. And just a few weeks back, we signed an MOU with Yara, the largest electricity producer in Japan, where they are aiming to reduce the emissions in their power production. And then part of that would be then to source ammonia to get access to zero emission hydrogen to feed into their network. And Japan has huge ambitions in that sense. And looking at their ambition level, we're talking about 30 million tons of ammonia by 2040 in order for them to meet their targets in Japan, and compare that to global ammonia production today of 180 million tons. It says something about the potential. So another opportunity as well, where you don't need to have a cable in order to connect new markets with renewable power.
Oh, that's good to hear. Yes.
Well, another very interesting aspect around the grid and the way it's used is that traditionally the whole electricity system has been designed in such a way that production follows demand. So people use electricity when they need it, and then production has to follow and produce what is needed. Well, in the future, we will have a system with more and more wind and solar. We believe that solar alone will constitute half of all the world's total production of electricity. And that obviously is only produced in the daytime.
Yes.
So it means that in the future, it will be more turned upside down. Demand needs to follow supply. So when there is electricity in abundance, it should be used. And then also in this aspect, hydrogen production and hydrogen turned into ammonia is interesting, because these processes needs to run pretty many hours in a year to be capital efficient, but they don't need to run constantly, particularly not the hydrogen production. The ammonia probably needs to run more stable. But when we produce hydrogen, is a choice. So then we can have an intermediate storage share of hydrogen gas before it's further processed, and that makes up a huge flexibility. And another source here will be charging of electric cars. When do we charge our cars? Of course, if you are on the road, you need to recharge it when you are at a charging station. But when you get back home and you just need it to be filled out during the night, well, then there will be systems allowing for when you do that. So this also will give room for an enormous amount of creativity in IT systems and control systems of how to adapt to varying supply and varying prices of electricity in the future.
So it's a tremendous optimization scheme here, really, to get it going.
Yeah, I don't believe there will be any single actor sitting there and say, we have a master plan of whoever consumes electricity at any point in time. It would be like trying to have a master plan on who is driving on the road from where to when. But it will be the electricity grid will be the road system. There will be a lot of traffic back and forth, but each part of this will be governed by electronics and IT systems.
Are you optimistic with respect to the transformation towards renewable society and more sustainable, carbon neutral?
I'm an optimist, especially when I see the momentum right now. But we have to be realistic as well that we are in a hurry, and that sort of urgency should follow both the decision making within companies, but also with governments, that we need to act now. But when it comes to technologies, we have, in many ways, we can continue to evolve technologies, but in order to meet the Paris Agreement, we don't need a huge technological breakthrough. Where we do need a breakthrough is on behavior, to collaborate throughout value chains, but also across value chains, together with governments, but also forming new partnerships, because we are in a hurry, and that's what I hope that we, together with Statkraft and Aker, that we're we're showing that we're bringing 3 companies together with different competences, but that creates synergies. You know, we're going to be much better than we would have been individually, and through that speed up the process. If we were to do this alone, it would have taken much longer time. If we can do it together, we can do it faster, and hopefully that inspires more companies to do the same.
Yeah, I think this is a start of a mega trend, like going from sail ships to modern combustion ships, or going from paper-based communication to electronic communication. It will happen, but it will take time. Yeah. And in the meantime, in this transition, which will be a long transition, the shorter the better, but we are talking about the energy supply to the whole world here. In that long transition, there will be need also for oil and gas and other sources of energy, and that needs to improve as well, as much as possible, but there's still a need there. So here in Norway and other countries producing oil and gas, that's also important to do that in a good way, and to continue to do so as long as we need it. So from that production, we can also produce hydrogen from what Svein Tore mentioned here, so-called blue hydrogen, where it is produced from methane, but the carbon coming out there, the CO2, is stored in the ground. So that is a very good combination of green hydrogen, like we are doing from electricity, but also from gas could be a supplement. And the skill base we have from the oil and gas sector is very good as recruitment opportunity into hydrogen and ammonia as well. So it's not only the energy that will shift, it's also what people do on the job.
But you, as the largest renewable energy producer in Europe, how influential are you on the politicians?
Well, again, we don't work in a vacuum here. We speak with all other electricity producers in Europe, yes. Particularly those who are interested in this transition and who is driving the developments towards more renewables. And combined, we have contact with EU politicians and politicians in almost all European countries on prime minister level. So I would say as a sector, we have quite some influence.
Time is really running fast here. I enjoy the conversation between us. A final question now about how competitive is Norway and industrialization and scale-up of green ammonia and hydrogen in Norway? Is that realistic, that we can be front runners on that? We are can, perhaps already. Yeah,
but it's important to keep in mind that the world is not going to be put on hold waiting for us to take advantage of that leading position that we already have. There's a huge amount of investments now going into the EU Green Deal. Look at what the US is doing now on sustainability, China, other Asian countries as well. There's a tremendous move now towards sustainability in industries and countries. We have a good starting point with our renewable power. I think we also have a good starting point with the very structure of our society, with the three-party collaboration between unions, the state, and the employers, and there's a level of trust as well that I think many would envy us, and which is a very important part of collaboration, because how are you going to collaborate if there is not a level of trust to begin with? So we have a lot of the pieces, but we have to make sure that we do it quickly now and take advantage of that position.
Yeah, so on top of all that, we need to work hard.
Yes.
To be fit for fight is not the same as winning a fight. No. And I think Norwegians, we in cooperation with our good friends in other countries, are able to do it, but it needs to be done.
That was a very good statement, and I think this discussion demonstrates also that there is mutual trust in the society of Norway to really an aligned will to get through the transformation. That's my perception of it. And when I listen to you guys, it sounds very impressive and also convincing that should happen actually. So this was a discussion I enjoyed so much. The formal questions I had now was for this half hour, and now we open up for Q&A from others, from externals. There should be some questions coming up. So first of all, just thank to both of you for sharing with us your knowledge and reflections from a corporate point of view as well as from a personal point of view, as I experience. You just showed it also personally how convinced, dedicated you both are. So I enjoyed that so much. So now there are numerous questions here. Here is one from Pauline Wien. She works with Total, Norway. With regard to behavioral change, it includes a change of mindset of consumer. How do you contribute to achieve that from your companies?
Well, I could start, and this is really key. I spent a lot of time on just that topic. How do we connect all the way to the consumer? Because we're an agriculture input provider. We give input to farmers, and farmers grow food, and then it goes through all the steps all the way to the consumer. And I think a lot of people, most people, would like to have a positive impact. But one of the challenges when you go to the supermarket today, you're able to read on the label the calories and the ingredients and so on. But there's nothing about carbon footprint. So you can't make a choice based on the carbon footprint when you're in the supermarket. And if you can't do that, there's no incentive going to the farmers to produce more environmentally friendly. We can't push this burden over to the farmers. And let me use an example here. 25% of greenhouse gas emissions come from the food system. And the farmers play an important role in that, but we know that their margins are quite small, so they can't absorb it. But if you take a coffee cup, if you go to the nearby coffee store here, you probably pay 30 Norwegian kroner and say $3. How much of that is going to the grower of the coffee beans? It's 1 cent. 1 cent is going to the farmer. And if you could create that traceability from the consumer to the farmer, we could help by, you could add a cent on top, given that it's produced in a certain way. And get that to the consumer. Today, the food system is not set up so that's possible, and that's something that I spend a lot of my time on, is to create transparency and traceability throughout the whole production of food, so that consumers can make choices based on their conviction, and that in turn could change the food system.
So you're not there at the moment, you say?
No, and that's the frustrating thing, because the technology is there, but we need to make these changes and create these tipping points that change the whole industry. And we've chosen from Yara to take a very active role in that and engage globally and trying to drive the food system in that direction. And we see some promising changes. Unilever, for instance, has committed to carbon label all their items within the next few years. Look at what Nestlé is doing now, PepsiCo, and so on. So a lot is happening, but we need to get this at big scale, and then we can make a huge change.
In Statkraft, we are directing efforts to consumers. In some cases, we have built up one of the leading charging networks called MER. So that's direct charging of electric cars. We are supplying district heating to a lot of buildings, and we are expanding that. And we are also marketing a new renewable electricity in various forms. But I think in what we are talking about here, an energy transition, is not going to happen only by individual consumers making choices. No. It has to be combined with policy. So it's an important part of the whole setup here is to argue publicly and privately that we want politicians to take part in this and bring on regulations that are driving in the right direction. So individual people as voters are probably even more important than the same people as consumers, I would say, to drive this change. To vote for politicians that are working in the right direction.
Does this mean that you as professional from a corporation point of view, how can you at best influence politicians and to make this accelerating?
Well, one thing that we're pretty good at from the business side is to create solutions at scale and that are able to develop by themselves. But as Christian said, it cannot be done in isolation. So there is an importance to demonstrate the opportunities and the need for regulation as well. Who's missing lead in gasoline, for instance, or look at refrigerators on CFC gases, for instance. That's regulated away, and when you have that framework in place, then it triggers scale and innovation. So this needs to be a joint effort.
The industry have to come up with the technical solutions. How do you produce a car that don't need lead in the gasoline? Then you need the politicians to differentiate the taxation on leaded versus unleaded, and finally to put a ban on lead. But the technology comes first. You cannot ban lead unless you have cars that can use it. You cannot avoid carbon emissions unless you have a technology alternative. So I think the best thing we can do is to come up with the good alternatives, make sure they are efficient, and then present them to politicians in such a way that it's easy to understand and can be decided upon as frameworks that are giving the necessary developments.
But that idea about bringing new alternatives or idea or technology, certainly the government also plays a role there. For instance, Enova, the energy fund, how could they play even more active role to create new markets, not just look at the pilots, but also go to the extreme, both novel technology take high risk, but also create new market? How could they stimulate to that?
I think they could have an expanded mandate to go for more large projects, not only small pilots. But of course, it needs to be in projects that really matters. So one has to look at the mandate of Enova. It's an excellent organization, but they need a mandate that is a bit larger than what they presently have.
Just echo the same thing. It's a great organization, and they're working on very exciting projects. But it's just allowing them to get a mandate that's big enough to create scale, so it's meaningful at world scale as well. So that would be a very good next step. But they're doing a lot of great work.
Yes, I think they do an excellent job, I think. Here is another question from Brazil, actually. Which one is better in carbon credits terms between green ammonia or hydrogen, and why?
Well, it depends on how we see it. If the thing with the hydrogen, if you need to transport it over distances, then the characteristics are such that it's uneconomical. And so if you produce hydrogen in one place and you need it somewhere else, then ammonia is the solution, because you can change the characteristics and you have a higher energy density. But if you need the renewable power or the hydrogen in the place where you produce it, well, then you just use hydrogen.
So both hydrogen and ammonia is emission-free when you use it. It only produces water and nitrogen in case of ammonia. So the difference is how you produce it, and you need more energy to produce ammonia than to produce hydrogen. So if you can choose, hydrogen is better. So ammonia is the best choice in situations where you cannot use pure hydrogen because the storage is a problem, like we discussed earlier.
That's true.
So in sequence, renewable electricity in its pure form is the best, hydrogen the second best, and ammonia the third best in this aspect. But we need them all.
And here is another question from FISSIS. For ammonia, what do you need to reach a profitable business model?
Well, there are already niches out there, but there's still niches. One thing is again a regulatory framework that appreciates a zero emission energy source, and that could be done through having a price on carbon emissions that allows for it. And then again, it depends also on the regulatory framework, whether you want a fossil alternative or the renewable alternative. And if a fossil is not an alternative, well then green ammonia could be competitive already today.
If regulations come to a point that it's not an alternative to have carbon emissions, then we are where we need. This is the most competitive fuel you can think of on applications on long distances. Probably will outcompete the biofuels and all other competition here. So what we need are regulations that put a high enough price on carbon, or that are compensating the cost to society of high carbon emissions.
Here is one more question about how big do you think the hydrogen/ammonia business will be compared to oil and gas business today? Could this be the start of a new renewable energy boom, similar to what the oil and gas business has been for Norway? That's a typical local Norwegian question, actually.
Well, it could definitely be a big industry. Today, global production of ammonia is 180 million tons. Most of it is captive already today, so the traded volume today is around 20 million tons of ammonia. And I mentioned Japan with their needs. That's 40 million tons of or 30 million tons of opportunity by 2040. You have then the whole shipping sector, which would add millions more. So you know, it's part of a solution. So there are many sources that are needed, but it could definitely be a very big industry.
It will be large, but not to Norway as large as the oil and gas sector in total.
No.
But if you add up biofuels, this renewable electricity, offshore wind, supply industry, everything, it will employ a lot of people and be really important both in revenues and employment. But there's no single industry that can replace the full oil and gas industry in Norway alone.
No.
That's true. And but in addition to employment and the export industry, we're also helping to solve one of the biggest challenges in the world now, and that is how do we reach the emission targets necessary in order to reach the Paris Agreement. And here we can play an important role in both providing solutions, but also demonstrating what is possible.
Now it's really back to the sense of urgency, as we talked about earlier, and really how to get that into the mind of the single, the individual, as well as into society at large. I think that's a big challenge, and we should fight for that, really, to get that going. That's my perception, at least, that we should go for that, really to fight, really to get it through, so that it will, on the long term, be the right solutions that we already now started. But here is one more question which is quite interesting. You mentioned the carbon tax and putting a price on emission. As many states are already doing that, how do you think can those who put in a price on carbon stay competitive in the international market?
Yeah, and this is a big challenge. How do you make sure that it's an advantage to be a front runner and building new industries, but at the same time do that in a way that you don't harm the companies as well, so that you see a shift of industries to areas with less regulation. Europe is working on this, on carbon border taxes and so on, but it's a hugely complicated area. But the key here is that it has to be a level playing field, so that we're not put at a disadvantage. And here, the dialogue between business and governments would be extremely important.
Yeah, so carbon border tax, which the EU is working on now, is probably the best answer to the question. But also, if this development is going fast, like we have seen in the transition to lead-free gasoline and low sulfur oils, etc., then it could be an advantage to be in the forefront of this technology development towards non-emitting fuels, even if it's not a carbon border tax system. It's simply because the technology is developing so fast, and so time is a factor here. One can live with a disadvantage for a few years.
Here's one more question. Do we agree that promotion of blue hydrogen as a dependable renewable fuel is in Norway's best interest as an exporting nation?
I would say yes. I think we should argue for that. And the world needs so much hydrogen that in order to be fast enough on the supply side, we need the blue hydrogen. As I just mentioned the example of how much capacity we need in electrolyzing capacity versus what the industry can provide now is a very serious limitation factor in itself. So the more hydrogen we can get from gas with the cleaning of CO2, the better it is.
I agree, and it's about creating the markets and the demand for the products as well. So I support both blue and green hydrogen, but it's important then that we're driving both, so that it's not only blue hydrogen, but that also there's support and drive to develop green hydrogen at world scale as well.
What is important to note here is that green hydrogen can be produced locally and in relatively small volumes. So they will be spearheading the hydrogen as technology. Also on single sites like Yara, it will be in large volume, but predominantly it will be many small projects. And so they will come first, and then the blue hydrogen can follow and fill the market again when it has been developed. Like the big trucks is following the small trucks in a way.
And the blue hydrogen, certainly the carbon capture issue is there all the time. And I think that the promises with the Longship and Northern Light projects are quite exciting, isn't it? I think this should be realistic to do so. What do you think?
Well, it demonstrates the willingness to cooperate both between state and private enterprises, but also in that area collaboration across. So that's definitely a positive and also needed in order to get the timelines right.
Yeah.
So that's probably one of the best things the oil industry can do to contribute here, to make sure that we have a clean gas, which is a mix of natural gas and a lot of hydrogen.
It's a great opportunity to utilize empty reservoirs, subsurface, so that's good. A final question here then. What are some of the technological advances we will have to make in order to reduce the amount of energy that is lost when converting renewable electricity to hydrogen, to ammonia, to make this an economically viable option for mass renewable electricity storage?
I think it will just be a bit of a reserve capacity. I don't believe much in a massive conversion of electricity into hydrogen or the next step into ammonia and then back to hydrogen and back to electricity again, we simply lose too much in each process step. So again, it could be part of the solution because we need to stabilize the grid, and there could be hydrogen-driven rotating equipment that can contribute, but that will be on the very top of the whole system. So what we dominantly need to do is the opposite. We need to make sure demand is following supply, as I mentioned, and also have other forms of stabilizing the electricity system. So I think hydrogen can play a role here, but not a big role. It's simply not efficient enough. The role of hydrogen and ammonia should be partly as direct into chemical processes like fertilizers, and partly as fuel for transportation, where we need something transportable that goes outside what the battery can carry, and then it is probably the most efficient thing we can do in the world, but not to convert it back into electricity again.
Final word, Svein Tore, to supplement Christian's statement.
Well, if I was to add just a final word, I'd like to end where I started. I think this is a huge opportunity, the most exciting one I've been faced with in my career, and where we have an opportunity now by being a first mover, building on the strengths that what we have as companies, but also on the nation to come up with solutions and create business opportunities there.
And then my last question to you guys. Which advice will you give to the new graduates in business and management for taking part or taking charge of the renewables transition? Who wants to take that?
Well, I've been asked this in many presentations at universities, but I think what we need more of is systems leadership, the ability to collaborate. We're way past the 1970s Milton Friedman philosophy of the business of business is business, and yes. we optimize each individual components. About leadership across. That's a very different kind of leadership, and it's about teamwork, seeing what do you do on one end of the value chain, and how does that impact all the way across. We need more competence and drive in that area.
My advice is follow your heart. Make sure you are working with something that you are really engaged in. So work with your own engagement, get engaged, and then your mind will follow.
That statement was so great. Follow the heart and be engaged. Thank you so much to both of you, to Christian and Svein Tore. This was a great event for BI alumni in energy and executive business. So thank you so much. Then we close the session.
Yes.